The wind howled through the ice-covered pine trees, each gust slicing across the silent Colorado mountains like a blade of frost. Beneath an old tree, where snow had hardened into stone-like patches, a small form trembled. A young bobcat, fur matted and soaked, eyes half shut and crusted with snow. It made no sound, no cries. It only breathed, faintly, weakly, and then barely even that. No one knew how long it had been left behind. There was no mother, no trace of a den, just tiny limbs curled from the cold and a sunken belly rising and falling in fading rhythm. In that moment, a figure appeared at the edge of the forest. Tall, snow-covered, gripping a military flashlight in one hand. The beam drifted across the tree trunks, then stopped. He bent down, and his heart nearly stopped. A life slipping away in silence. Thomas Reed was familiar with silence. 17 years alone in a wooden cabin deep in the woods had turned his heart as still as the frozen surface of a winter lake. Beautiful, but solitary. He'd once been a federal ranger, seasoned and respected, a man who had rescued many wild animals from traps, bullets, and storms, but he hadn't been able to save his son. That snowstorm years ago had taken everything, his family, his reputation, his purpose. Since then, he had vanished into the forest, accompanied only by wind, pine, and occasionally the call of an owl at midnight. That morning, at -20 degrees Fahrenheit, Thomas had only meant to chop more firewood. But when he saw the strange tracks on the fresh snow, tiny, erratic, and abruptly ending, he followed out of curiosity. What he found wasn't a wild rabbit, but a creature teetering on the edge of life. The baby bobcat, no bigger than a house cat, had triangular ears and faint white markings around its mouth, unmistakably a true bobcat. A rare one, especially to be wandering alone, especially in winter. The only reason it would be left behind was because it wasn't chosen to live. Thomas stood frozen, his mind filled with voices, logic, instinct, conservation law, all of them shouting, "Walk away. This isn't your concern." But he didn't move. The cold crept down his collar, biting his spine. The only thing still moving was the kitten's chest, rising and falling like embers about to go out. "Why are you still trying?" he thought, and without knowing why. He knelt, pulled off his glove, and touched the kitten's back with a rough, calloused palm. It was cold as stone. No response, but there was still a trace of warmth. Instead of turning away, Thomas yanked off his wool scarf and gently wrapped the tiny body. He held it close to his chest, as if one more minute might be too late. His cabin was just under a mile away, but the path had turned into a frozen maze. He walked slowly, each step sinking deep into the snow. The bobcat didn't stir, not a sound. At home, he lit the stove and placed it on a towel near the fire. He didn't hope, didn't expect. He just couldn't let it die alone, cold and silent. 30 minutes later, when he returned, the first sound wasn't the wind. It was a faint, broken rasp, like a kitten trying to meow through cracked lips. The bobcat opened its eyes. One was swollen shut, but the other looked at him, not with fear, but a dazed trust. His heart clenched. How long had it been since anyone had looked at him that way? That night, Thomas didn't leave the fireplace. He used a spoon to feed the bobcat some diluted milk. It licked slowly, tired but trying. When he dozed off in the chair, the small creature curled up, its back touching his ankle, like a quiet full stop to a strange day. No one knew if it would survive the night. But in that moment, in a lonely cabin deep in the snowy woods, two abandoned souls had found each other, not to save one another, but to keep each other from slipping into the eternal cold of life. The next morning, pale sunlight filtered through the frosted window panes, casting streaks of light on the worn wooden floor. Thomas opened his eyes, shoulders stiff from sleeping in a chair, but he didn't rise right away. His gaze turned to the other side of the hearth, where the little bobcat still lay, curled like a small gray stone. It was breathing that brought both relief and weight to his chest. A part of him had hoped it wouldn't make it through the night. Not out of cruelty, but because if it died, everything would be over. Clean, simple, no attachment, no complications. But now it was alive, and life, no matter how fragile, was a tether, a bond pulling him back towards something he had rejected for years: emotion, connection, and responsibility. Thomas dragged the chair closer to the window, tin cup in hand, pouring more hot coffee from the kettle on the stove. He sipped, bitter. Smoke drifted into his nose, stinging. Outside, the snow was still falling. The forest stretched white and endless, offering no way back. The cold outside seemed less piercing than the chill that hovered inside his heart. He had lived by one clear principle: do not interfere too much with nature. Nature had its own laws. The weak are left behind. Intervening often meant disrupting balance. It was a lesson he had taught countless younger rangers. And yet, yesterday, he had carried a wild bobcat home. If someone else had done it, he might have scolded them. "Old fool," he muttered, but he couldn't convince himself. The kitten stirred. Its head lifted briefly, then dropped again. It was too weak to cry, only its nose twitching slightly with each breath. Thomas stared at its bony frame, and something inside him twisted suddenly, like a blow he hadn't braced for. An old image, buried for years, rose again. It was another snowy morning, but that time it was a child's voice. "Dad, wait for me." Small feet ran across icy snow, then slipped. A cry. He had turned back, but not fast enough. The ice on the creek hadn't frozen evenly. One misstep, and his little boy was gone. They called it an accident. People tried to comfort him, but no one could erase what he'd felt from that day to this one. Guilt. Thomas hunched forward, head between his knees. He didn't cry. He couldn't. The tears had dried long ago, but his heart still knew how to ache. By noon, he added more wood to the fire. The room warmed. The bobcat kept its eyes open longer now. It still couldn't stand, but it licked its lips when he dripped warm goat milk onto its tongue. Using a small syringe, one he used for baby squirrels or owls, he fed it drop by drop. It swallowed slowly, coughing now and then. Its throat seemed injured too. After a few tries, it went still, exhausted. He dabbed its mouth with a soft cloth, and his trembling hand touched its head. Warm, soft, fragile. For some reason, the bobcat didn't pull away. It leaned gently into his palm as if it wanted to lean in, as if it knew this was the only thing left holding it back from the cold, quiet death outside. Evening fell, and the snow kept falling as if it never grew tired. Thomas stepped onto the porch, flashlight in hand. He pointed it into the distance, toward the slope leading into the deep woods, where he had first found it. What was he looking for? Its mother's footprints. It's a pack, or someone searching for it. Number There was nothing, only the white forest and the howling wind. The creature had truly been left behind, just like him, forgotten by the world. In the old basement archive, Thomas found several notebooks on wildlife care. A fragment of his old life came alive. Years spent training bear cubs, rescuing eagles with broken wings, tending to trapped fawns. But never once had he brought a wild animal into his home. Only his son. And now, this tiny creature. He reread the key steps in emergency bobcat care, maintaining warmth, monitoring digestion, tracking respiration, and milk dosage. All required patience, precision, and above all, emotional detachment. But for him, that was already impossible. That night, Thomas placed a padded basket beside the stove. The bobcat was gently transferred into it, wrapped in a thin cloth. Its breathing now steadier. It slept a lot. But every time it opened its eyes, it looked in one direction, the spot where Thomas usually sat with his coffee. The next morning, he woke early, mixed milk, checked its stool, and measured temperature. Every sign pointed to one thing. It was recovering, slowly but surely. He named it Ash, not for its ashen fur, but because it reminded him of a lost ember in a dying fireplace, thought to be out, yet still faintly burning. And strangely, that ember was warming the heart of a man who had long believed his own had gone cold. Though the world outside was skin-cutting cold, inside that wooden cabin, a quiet miracle was happening. A man who thought he had nothing left to lose, a creature that thought it had no path left to live. Both, broken, alone, found each other. And when Thomas placed his hand on that small back on the third day, he felt a faint vibration, like a soft growl deep in its throat, so quiet, so weak, yet unmistakably there, the first sound of trust. He knew then, nothing from here on would be simple. Snow continued for 7 straight days. The deep forest was entirely cut off. Even the trail leading to the small town at the mountain's base was buried in knee-deep ice. Thomas's cabin, humble, perched halfway up the mountain, became its own isolated world, where man and nature curled inward to survive the harshest winter in years. And in that frozen world, a fragile life was healing. Ash, the little bobcat, was out of danger, no longer shivering from the cold, no longer lying still like a stone. It began lifting its head, then staggering to its feet on skinny legs, its deep amber eyes now more alert. Still weak, still wheezing, but it looked straight at Thomas. The man who had carried it out of the ice, spooned warm milk down its throat, and kept its inner fire from going out. That look stirred something in him. Thomas had seen animals saved many times before. During his years as a ranger, he'd nursed eagles with broken wings, injured fawns, and even helped deliver a stuck deer in a rock field. But with Ash, everything was different. Not just because it was so small, so alone, but because of the quiet, unconscious bond he couldn't control. This wildcat hadn't just come back to life. It had begun to touch something inside him, a part long buried beneath the ashes of memory. On the 8th night after that fateful day, while Thomas was mixing milk, he heard something behind him, a soft tap on the wooden floor. He turned. Ash, small, head tilted, was quietly stepping out of the basket beside the stove. It was the first time it had walked a short distance on its own. It walked toward him, each step slow, unsteady. When it reached him, it didn't make a sound. It simply leaned its head against his ankle. Thomas froze. The hand holding the milk trembled. That tiny, instinctive act, It struck a massive blow to the shell of solitude he'd built around himself for years. Ash didn't need to speak. That head lean held everything he had long forgotten. Trust, the need for one another, a silent connection between two abandoned souls. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat by the fire, watching Ash doze, and doors long locked inside him began to open. He remembered a dream he'd once left behind, to be a guardian for injured wildlife, those unable to return to the wild, yet not meant for zoos. He had once dreamed of building a small mountain center for healing, for recovery. But then, the accident took his son, and that dream died with the child's final cry, swallowed by ice. Since then, he had vanished into the woods, not to find peace, but to escape himself. Ash knew nothing of that past. It only knew warmth, cold, hunger, fullness, and those wounded eyes, no different than the child's from long ago, still made it impossible for him to turn away. And for that reason, the fear began to grow. A voice whispered inside him like the wind howling over the rooftop. "You're making the same mistake, clinging to something you can't keep." On the 15th day, Ash began to play. It batted at yarn, scratched the table legs, and crept toward the window to watch the snow fall. Curious, bold, as if it remembered nothing of death. But Thomas remembered. He knew bobcats were wild. As it grew, it would no longer be this sweet, helpless creature. The day would come when it must return to nature. Or worse, be discovered and taken away. So, he began, pulling away. He no longer let Ash sleep near the bed, no longer held it close, no longer spoke to it. He fed it, cared for it, but avoided intimacy. Each time Ash approached, he gently placed it back in the basket or lifted it away, as if to say, "I'm only a stopover, not your home." Ash seemed confused. At first it kept approaching, but slowly it withdrew, as if it understood the one place that had been warmest in its life was now closing its doors. And for a creature once abandoned, that rejection was a cold far crueler than snow. By the 21st night, Ash no longer played. It ate less. It didn't purr, didn't paw at the air, didn't lean on him. It simply lay by the window, eyes gazing out into the forest. The way it curled up, still eyes wide and unblinking, stabbed at Thomas's heart, as if it were waiting for the inevitable, to be left again. Thomas sat at the table, coffee long cold. He thought about tomorrow. He'd wrap Ash in a blanket, place it in a basket, and carry it down to the ranger station at the mountain base. The form was filled, the paperwork ready, and the rescue center's address written down. All that was left was to tie the rope to the basket handle. But he couldn't. His hand wouldn't lift the rope. Instead, he picked up the form and tore it into pieces. That night, for the first time in days, he approached Ash. It didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't come closer, just lie still. Thomas sat down slowly and placed his hand on its back. 1 second, 2, then 3. Ash turned its head. Those eyes, slightly wet. It didn't cry, but it had waited. And then, very gently, it pressed its face into his hand, just like it had the first time. Thomas bent down, his forehead touching Ash's, and whispered, "I'm sorry for almost leaving you again." No one in the forest heard, but in that wooden cabin where the fire still crackled and ashes floated gently in the air, something ancient, something deeply human, returned. From the moment Thomas laid his hand on Ash's back and whispered his apology, the snow-covered cabin seemed to change. The wind still howled outside, snow still fell, shadows still stretched across the whitened ground. But within the home, a new warmth emerged, not from the stove, but from something more invisible. Life given wholeheartedly. Ash began to change. It ate more, moved quicker. Its eyes no longer held the dull glaze of those first nights. Instead, they glinted with playful mischief the way any kitten should. It climbed onto the windowsill, nibbled the tablecloth's edge, and even once stole one of Thomas's thick socks and dragged it into the attic like treasure. Thomas didn't scold. He simply stood and watched quietly. Each mischievous act was a clear sign. It was coming back to life. Not just in body, but in spirit. Thomas built Ash a small training yard in the old storage shed behind the house. He stacked rotting logs into climbing stations, hid bits of food inside tiny crevices, encouraging its hunting instincts. Each day, Ash ventured out there, crouching, clawing, climbing, leaping, as if it had never nearly frozen to death, never once laid motionless waiting for the end. And in each of those little leaps, Thomas saw himself being pulled out of darkness. For weeks, he no longer woke in the night from the same familiar nightmares, the wind calling his name, the crack of shattering ice, the thundering beat of his heart for not reaching his son in time. Those echoes still lingered, lurking in the corners of the room, but they no longer consumed him. When he awoke, he saw Ash sleeping nearby, eyes half closed, belly rising and falling with steady breath, and he knew he was no longer entirely alone. There's something strange only those who've lost deeply can understand. New life doesn't replace what was lost, but it helps you bear the memory. One early morning in March, the sun broke through. The forest was still white, but the sky was no longer gray. Thomas opened the front door, letting the cold rush in, and Ash, now nearly reaching his knee, cautiously stepped outside. It was the first time it had set paw beyond the cabin since being rescued. No leash, no cage, just a yard covered in frost, dry leaves rustling in the breeze, and a sky that was impossibly blue. Ash paused on the doorstep. It lifted its head, ears twitching, breathing deep as if recognizing this was the world it truly belonged to. Thomas stood behind, leaning on the doorframe, heart still. He didn't call it back, didn't stop it. He only waited to see, would it leave or return? Ash walked a few steps, slowly, then broke into a run, stumbled over a branch, rolled and rose again. It chased a falling leaf, pounced at a bird's shadow, then collapsed in the snow, panting. After half an hour, it returned to Thomas, tongue lolling, paws muddy, eyes shining like it had just conquered the world. Thomas bent down and patted its head. "Good job, Ash." It was the first thing he had said in hours. From that day on, Ash went outside daily, each time farther, each time longer, but always returned. Sometimes with a chirp, a distant glance, a nuzzle at his ankle. It never stayed gone too long. Though no longer a ranger, Thomas still kept in touch with a few field stations in town. One day, a young officer sent him documents from the Wildlife Service about bobcats recovering in the wild after injury. Thomas printed them out, read each line carefully. His heart tightened when he reached the section, "Avoid imprinting," a condition where young animals bond too deeply with human caregivers, losing their ability to survive independently. Beneath it, a recommendation. Once recovered, reduce human interaction, reignite wild instincts, transfer to a rehabilitation center for release evaluation. Thomas set the paper down, looking at Ash curled up beneath the table. He knew sooner or later this moment would come. But between reason and the heart, there's always a long stretch of silence. One cold, rainy afternoon, Ash leapt into his lap and fell asleep. The damp scent of fur, the soft rumble of a purr near his chest. Thomas knew if he had to say goodbye, he would lose something again. And this time, he might not recover. But Ash was growing, faster than Thomas expected. 6 weeks after full recovery, it was strong, agile. It climbed trees, caught mice, hid leftover food, and most impressively, learned to detect strangers near the cabin's perimeter. One night, a noise stirred outside. Thomas grabbed his flashlight and saw a lone wolf circling near the woodpile. Before he could step out, Ash rushed to the window, letting out a low, deep growl. The wolf backed off, didn't dare approach. Thomas slowly lowered his hand. It had been reaching for the hunting rifle above the door, but he didn't need it. For the first time, he felt protected. The next morning, he wrote to the ranger station. Not to report that he was illegally keeping a bobcat, but to request permission to adopt Ash under semi-wild conditions, trained in survival and medically monitored. He didn't expect approval, but he wrote it because he knew you can't hide forever. While waiting for a reply, Thomas began training Ash like a working dog, recognizing danger signals, reacting to whistles, and returning when called. Ash learned quickly. It wasn't a pet, it was a free creature. But it chose to stay. Between a man who had once died inside and a wild animal once waiting for death, a quiet alliance formed. No leashes, no cages, just connection. And then, one late afternoon, as golden light filtered through falling pine needles like powdered sun, Thomas received a letter from the station. The words were short, plain. After reviewing the habitat and recovery progress of the bobcat, we approve your proposal for long-term care. Please submit health updates every 3 months. Thank you for saving this animal. Thomas read the final line, and his heart felt a shade lighter. The sky dimmed into ash gray. Heavy clouds hung overhead, swollen as if waiting to break, but they held. The air grew thick with a feeling hard to name, quiet, pressing, as if nature itself was holding its breath for a decision it couldn't make alone. Thomas sat on the porch, hand loosely cradling a mug of cold coffee. At his feet, Ash lay still, tail flicking gently with every passing breeze. Nothing happened that day. And it was exactly that, nothing happened, that made him think the most. The bobcat had grown, shoulders broader, steps more assured. Muscles rippled under its gray coat with every breath. Its eyes, once blurred with weakness, now burned amber bright, alert, wild. As it stepped beyond the edge of the porch, back arched, ears upright, its body radiated the wild essence of a creature never meant for humans. And it was this very truth that pierced Thomas's heart. He knew Ash was ready. Its body said so, its instincts said so. The forest, with its wind, its scent of blood, bird tracks, and dew-drenched thickets, was calling it home. Only he was not ready. There were moments he thought, if I keep Ash, life won't be so lonely. He could build a larger enclosure, keep it semi-wild, teach it more hand signals. Every night, its presence by his feet, the soft purring, warm breath against his shirt. An unspoken companionship Thomas never thought he'd find again. But he knew, keeping a wild animal when it's ready to leave is a form of possession. To do so would be no different than forcing it to live a life that goes against its nature. Ash wasn't born to be kept, nor raised to be displayed. It was born for freedom, and he, no matter how deeply he loved it, could not hold on to something that was never his to keep. That day, he stepped into the storage room. Lifting the lid of an old, dusty wooden chest, he retrieved something he had kept for years, a soft canvas collar with a small silver tag shaped like a paw. It was meant for a search and rescue dog he once worked with. That dog never came back, and since then, the collar had been forgotten at the bottom of the trunk. Thomas wiped it clean with the edge of his shirt, then quietly walked over to Ash. No words, no commands, just a meeting of eyes. Ash didn't resist as he fastened the collar around its neck. It stood still, then inhaled softly. The silver glinted against its dark gray fur, like a silent talisman. Then he opened the front door. No call, no signal, no urging. Ash walked to the threshold, paused. A gust of wind swept in from the deep woods. It lifted its head, breathed deeply, and then it turned to look at him. No anger, no hesitation, just a gaze, still, deep, solemn, as if it had known this day would come all along. A moment stretched, timeless. Ash turned, walked away. Each step light, slow, without looking back. Its figure faded into the brush, then vanished into the forest. Thomas stood at the door, arms slack at his sides. He didn't call out, didn't chase. He simply couldn't take his eyes off where Ash had disappeared. Silence wrapped the cabin like a thin sheet. No more tails scratching softly on wooden floors. No more startled growls when the wind blew too hard. No more of those eyes. Eyes that knew how to wait, how to trust, and how to stay. Thomas returned inside, poured more coffee, but didn't drink it. The scent no longer stirred anything. Every corner of the house remained the same except for one thing. It lacked a breath. The next day, and the ones after, the cabin returned to its original stillness. Each morning, Thomas still rose early, lit the fire, brewed his coffee, and wrote in his journal. But no confused stare met him from under the table. No quiet gaze watched from the windowsill. He went to the shed and tidied Ash's things. The old sleeping basket, the chipped water bowl, the chewed-up ball of yarn. He didn't throw them out, just packed them neatly in the corner to preserve a piece of memory. A quiet reminder that this place had once held a warmth beyond his own. One day, while cleaning the table, he noticed a faint scratch, like a claw mark on the windowsill's wooden frame. Barely there. Maybe it was just play, or maybe a marker to remember the way home. And somehow, he believed in the latter. Thomas didn't go searching for Ash in the woods, didn't follow the tracks, didn't set traps. He understood. If Ash wanted to return, it would find the way. If not, he would still be grateful for the days they had. There are moments in life when we don't truly need someone to stay forever. We just need to know we were once the place where they came alive again. And that's enough. The sky shifted into pale amber. The last light of day streamed through the pines, scattering across the wooden porch like trails of memory. Thomas was splitting wood by the side of the house, each strike steady, resonant, echoing into the still air, like the breath of someone who had learned how to slow down and live with himself. Ash had been gone a long time. No more tracks, no more nighttime scratching at the door, no more eyes in the window frame. And Thomas, after days of waiting, had learned not to wait anymore. He still rose early, still lit the fire, still brewed his coffee, but he no longer looked up when the breeze swept past, no longer hoped at every gray shadow slipping through the trees. Ash had returned to where it belonged, and Thomas was learning how to return to himself. That evening, out of habit, he set his tin cup on the windowsill and looked out. The forest whispered as always. Nothing had changed, but then, at the edge of the nearest aspen tree, he saw movement. Not clear, not fast, just a shadow, flickering behind the brush. Thomas squinted. A bobcat, standing still, head lifted. He couldn't be sure it was Ash. Maybe another, but something in the posture, the tilt of its head, the slow swaying of its tail, made his heart tighten. He didn't know how he knew. He just did. Thomas didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there, hand resting on his cup. Silent, as if any sound might scare it away. The bobcat stepped forward, held the distance, didn't come closer, but it didn't leave. A long silence passed. Then it lowered its head, not in fear, but in a way that felt like a farewell. And then it turned, vanished behind the trees. Thomas didn't feel sadness. On the contrary, he felt lighter than he had in years. He smiled. Not because Ash had come back, but because it remembered the way, and more importantly, it had chosen to return, even just for a few seconds, to look at him from afar and let him know. We were once something unforgettable in each other's lives. That night, sitting by the fire, he wrote a single line in his notebook. Some creatures come into our lives not to stay. They come to awaken the best part of us we forgot existed. No one visited his cabin in the days that followed. No one needed to, and no one had to know the story of that bobcat or of the man who once lay silent beneath his memories. Because the deepest things in life are rarely spoken aloud. They are kept in silence, in one final look, in a warmth that touches you once and stays forever. And on late nights, when the forest wind whistled through the cracks in the cabin door, Thomas would often smile and whisper a phrase no one else could hear. Go on, Ash, as long as you know the way back. Some lives seem abandoned in the cold snow, but sometimes all it takes is one extended hand, a little warmth, a little trust, and everything can come alive again. We don't always save other beings, but sometimes they save us. If you believe that kindness can change a life, help us share this story. Hit like, subscribe, and share this video with other animal lovers like you. And don't forget to leave a comment below. Have you ever been saved by an animal in some way? We would love to read your story.